Picture this: a black man works in a restaurant, giving 100% of his time, but his boss, a racist chef, decides he doesn't belong in the kitchen and tries to fire him. What happens next? You certainly don't expect this. And before we continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from. Me always interesting find out how far are spreading such stories. The chef had been looking askance at the young black employee for a long time. Every action he took, even the most insignificant ones, irritated the chef. He found fault with little things, took out his anger for the restaurant's failures on this guy, clearly wanting only one thing: to get rid of him. And then one day the situation reached its peak. In the midst of the busiest evening, the chef decides that he has found a reason to fire him. The guy was 2 minutes late, and this gave the chef a reason to make a real scandal. "That's it, you're fired," the chef yells across the room, drawing the attention of the other employees. The atmosphere in the kitchen becomes tense. Everyone freezes, afraid to even breathe. Watching this humiliation, the guy who had been trying to keep his cool until now takes a deep breath. He knew this moment would come, but he was ready. Instead of panicking or making excuses, he silently removes his apron and calmly says, "I think you should talk to the restaurant owner." These words confuse the chef. He chuckles nervously, confident in his untouchability, but the guy doesn't budge. Within a few minutes of silence, the owner of the establishment appears in the kitchen. When he enters the kitchen, the chef turns pale. It turns out that the black employee is not just one of many workers. He is a longtime friend of the owner, a man who helped develop the restaurant from the very beginning, and now he is in full support of the one he trusts. "What's going on here?" the owner asks sternly. The chef tries to explain, making up excuses on the fly, but the words ring hollow and empty. All that remains in the kitchen is a sense of injustice, which will now turn against the chef himself. "I see you've decided to take on the role of judge and executioner," the owner says calmly but firmly. "There's no room here for people who judge others by the color of their skin." The owner of the restaurant looked at the chef. His face was impassive, but his eyes were filled with cold determination. This was the moment of truth. A silence fell over the kitchen, so thick it seemed you could cut it with a knife. Everyone froze, sensing that something important was happening, something that could change the atmosphere of the place forever. The chef tried to hide his anxiety behind a mask of confidence, but his nervous movements gave him away. "Look, I'm just doing my job. This guy is constantly late. He's not getting things done, and it's affecting all of us," he began, trying to give his words some weight. But the owner already knew what was going on. He'd been there long enough to see how the chef picked on a young employee for no apparent reason, how racism and bias poisoned the kitchen. "Your job is to manage the team, not to demean and discriminate," the owner said firmly. "I know what goes on in this kitchen. I know this guy is one of the best employees, and your accusations are based not on his performance, but on the color of his skin." The owner's words struck the chef like a bolt of lightning. He tried to object, but each time he ran into iron logic and facts. "You've been noticed more than once to find fault with him. Do you think we haven't noticed? I won't allow a person to work in my restaurant who divides people into us and them because of their skin color." A storm of emotions erupted. Tension reigned in the kitchen. Colleagues who had previously tried to stay out of it now understood that they were witnessing not just a conflict, but a moment that exposed a deep problem that had existed there for a long time. The chef found himself face to face with the most serious of accusations: racism. The young employee, who had been silent until now spoke. His voice was calm, but every word rang out as a truth that could not be ignored. "How many times have I tried to prove my competence? How many times have I tried to be better, worked twice as hard as others, but you never saw it. All you saw was the color of my skin. You thought that was enough to write me off." The words cut to the quick. The chef, who had no arguments or confidence left, sank. He knew he had lost. At that moment, his authority was completely destroyed. The owner continued, "I didn't create this restaurant to be a place of hatred and prejudice. We are a family here, and one thing is important to all of us: hard work, talent, and respect for each other. If you can't understand that, you don't belong here." The boss tried to say something, but the owner raised his hand, stopping him. "Your work here is done. We can't allow a man with such views to remain on our team." With these words, the chef was fired. His pride and career, built on prejudice and hatred, had been destroyed in one evening. Left alone in the kitchen, the young employee felt not a sense of triumph, but a deep relief. He did not want revenge, did not want conflict. He simply wanted to work equally with others and be valued for his merits, not for his appearance. This story became a turning point for the entire team. Those who had previously been afraid to speak out saw that justice was possible. The atmosphere in the kitchen changed. Now there was respect and cooperation, not fear and mistrust. Racism is not just individual words or actions, it is a systemic problem that destroys not only the lives of those it directly affects, but also the entire team, the entire society. However, the fight for justice begins with each of us, with our actions and decisions. The restaurant owner made a choice in favor of equality and respect, setting an example for everyone who will face a similar situation. After the chef left, the atmosphere in the kitchen was tense, as if everyone was holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The employees exchanged glances that were a mixture of relief and confusion. No one knew how long the problem of racism had been lurking within the walls of the restaurant, but now it was out in the open, naked and undeniable. The owner, collecting his thoughts, looked at the young employee and said quietly but firmly, "You've proven yourself worthy of being here. Let's work together to make this place better." For the young employee, this was the moment he had been waiting for, not to prove his worth to anyone, but to finally feel safe. He nodded gratefully, but deep down he knew there was a long road ahead. One firing wouldn't solve everything. The racism was deeper than just one person, and it would take time and teamwork to change it. The first days after the chef's dismissal passed in tense silence. The staff tried to stick together, but it was obvious that everyone was asking questions. How would this affect the restaurant? Who would take the place of the fired chef? Would the new person be better or worse? But most importantly, how would this situation change them all? The owner knew he had to act quickly and decisively. A few days later, a new chef arrived at the restaurant, a man with an impeccable reputation for his talent and respect for his colleagues. He immediately called a staff meeting. "I'm not here to just run the kitchen," he said. "I'm here to build a team where everyone feels respected and valued, no matter who you are or where you're from." The new boss's words gave hope. Gradually, employees began to open up to each other, discussing things that had previously been hushed up. People who had worked side by side for years but had never really spoken began to find common ground. The young employee at the center of this story felt something changing, not only in the team, but also in his own soul. Now his colleagues looked at him not as that guy the chef tried to fire, but as a person who, despite all the difficulties, remained steadfast and set an example for everyone. This gave him confidence. He began to take initiative, offer ideas for improving the kitchen, share his experience and knowledge. The new chef supported him, giving him space to grow. Over time, the restaurant became known not only for its food, but also for the atmosphere of respect and equality that reigned in the kitchen. Customers felt it, and the flow of visitors increased. The establishment became an example of how the fight against discrimination can lead not only to a moral victory, but also to business success. But the main change was in the hearts of the people. The restaurant workers learned to look at each other in a new way, without prejudice. They realized that racism is not only open hatred, but also small, everyday prejudices that can ruin lives, and it is these small prejudices that must be overcome first. One evening, as the workday was drawing to a close, the new chef gathered everyone around the table. "Today, we didn't just do a good job," he began. "Today, we took another step toward creating a place where everyone can feel equal. This isn't just a fight against racism, it's a fight for humanity." The young employee, sitting at the table with the others, looked at his colleagues and realized that everything had changed. Not just the restaurant, not just the people around him, but himself. He no longer felt like an outsider. He was part of something bigger, part of a team, part of a family where everyone mattered. This is not just a story about defeating racism. It is a story about how each of us can be a force for change in the world. Sometimes all it takes is perseverance, not backing down from injustice, and remembering that even one person can spark change that affects everyone around them. In the months following the firing of the racist chef, The restaurant gradually became a place of respect and fairness. The new chef cared about each employee, and it seemed that all the negative moments were in the past. But, as often happens, problems related to bias and racism do not disappear so easily. They hide deep, waiting for their moment. A young black employee who had once been a victim of injustice began to notice something strange. Although the team had become more friendly, he couldn't help but feel the cold stares of some customers. The restaurant was frequented by influential and wealthy people, and not all of them were ready to accept the changes. One night, something happened that he had never expected. It was a typical Friday night. The place was packed. A young employee was doing his job as usual, running between the kitchen and the dining room, helping his colleagues. Suddenly, one of the regulars approached him, a large, self-confident middle-aged man who always looked at him with disdain. He grabbed his arm sharply and, bringing his face closer, said through clenched teeth, "You don't belong here. This restaurant used to be for decent people, not for people like you." The words burned him like hot metal. It seemed like a nightmare he had long ago gotten rid of, but reality returned with new cruelty. For a moment, images of his old boss, of prejudice, of struggle flashed through his mind. His heart began to beat faster, and he felt the familiar feeling of humiliation and helplessness wash over him again. "Let me go," he said calmly but firmly, pulling his hand away. He couldn't afford to show weakness, although inside everything was screaming with resentment. But the man did not back down. Rising to his feet, he began to shout across the room, attracting the attention of the other guests. "I'm not going to pay money to be served by such people. What kind of place has this become? Fire him immediately." A deathly silence fell over the room. All eyes were on the man and the young employee. Some were whispering, some were filming on their phones. It was a moment of shame that destroyed the fragile confidence the guy had worked so hard to build. He felt his body tremble treacherously, as excitement and shame overwhelmed him with renewed vigor. But the most painful thing was that among some of the guests there were those who secretly agreed with the man's cries. By this time, the owner of the restaurant had come out into the hall. He silently approached the screaming man, who had already managed to attract the attention of everyone around him, and calmly but firmly said, "Please leave our establishment." The man, initially stunned by such a refusal, became even more angry. "Are you serious? You mean to say that you will defend this one?" He looked around the room, as if trying to find support among the other customers, but no one dared to support him openly. "This man is my employee and I will not tolerate him being treated like a piece of trash. If you have any complaints, please leave. Your money is not wanted here," the owner said coldly, without losing his composure. The man, realizing that his public humiliation had backfired, rushed to the door, throwing out a few angry words as a finale. It would seem that the incident was over, but its consequences were much deeper. That night, when the restaurant emptied and the employees began to go home, the young man stayed in the kitchen longer than usual. He stood at the sink, monotonously washing dishes, but his thoughts were far away. Images of the past surfaced, old grievances, humiliations, injustices. All the pain that he had so carefully hidden deep inside began to burst out. Tears slowly rolled down his cheeks, despite all his efforts to hold them back. He thought that all this was behind him, that the victory over racism had been won, but now he realized that the real fight was just beginning. No matter how successful the work was, no matter what changes were happening inside the team, the world outside remained cold and cruel. There were people who would never accept him as an equal, no matter what. This thought cut through him like a knife, leaving a deep scar in his soul. A few days later, the fallout from the incident began to show. The restaurant owner received several complaints from customers who supported the man, claiming that service had gone downhill, that the restaurant had lost its elite feel. Social media began to seethe with negativity, fueling old prejudices and accusing the restaurant of losing its identity. Customer traffic began to decline, and the restaurant's financial situation began to deteriorate. It was a difficult moment for the owner. To protect his employee meant to jeopardize his business, but he could not betray his principles. He gathered his team and frankly said, "We are going through difficult times, but this is a test. We have proven that we are ready to fight for justice, but this is only the beginning. I cannot promise that it will be easy, but we must stand for our beliefs. but the financial problems continued to mount. The restaurant became emptier every day, and the owner had to make tough decisions. He cut hours, slashed wages, but despite all his efforts, the end seemed inevitable. For the young employee, this was a real tragedy. He felt guilty, although he knew that he had done everything right. His fight for justice, for the right to be equal, led to people turning away. He saw his colleagues quietly discussing what was happening, and he felt that they also blamed him for it. One night, when the restaurant was closed and the owner was counting his losses, the boy approached him. "Maybe I should leave," he said quietly. "I don't want to be the cause of all this trouble. Maybe if I'm not here, everything will go back to normal." The owner looked up and stared at him for a long moment before replying, "You are not the cause of these problems. The cause is the people who are not ready to accept change. Leaving is not an option. We must continue to fight, even if it costs us everything." And although the owner's words gave hope, there was pain in the boy's heart. He knew that in the world outside the restaurant, he would always have to prove his right to be equal, and no matter how many times he won, each new day brought new challenges. It was a path full of pain, but he knew one thing: despite all the suffering, he would never lower his head again. After that conversation with the owner, the young man returned to work, but now his thoughts were filled with doubts and fears for the future. The restaurant that had become almost a second home for him was on the verge of closing. Each shift felt like a battle, not only for the customers, but also for the ideals they had defended for so long. However, reality increasingly reminded him that this was a battle they could lose. With each passing day, the number of customers dwindled. Regulars who had previously supported the restaurant began to disappear one by one. Some refused to come because of the overwhelming negativity on social media. Others were perhaps just looking for a reason to leave. Every day brought news of losses: another reservation canceled, another customer choosing competitors. The restaurant, which had once flourished, now stood half empty. The young employee saw his colleagues begin to lose faith. Even the new boss, who had initially inspired hope, became gloomier, more silent. The guy noticed how some employees were whispering, expressing dissatisfaction behind his back. Their looks when he passed were full of reproach in their eyes. He was the one who brought all these problems to the restaurant, and although he knew that it was not he who was to blame, but racism and prejudice, a feeling of guilt arose inside. One night, when the place closed earlier than usual due to a lack of customers, he again stayed in the kitchen longer than anyone else. Washing dishes had become something of a ritual for him, a moment when he could be alone with his thoughts. Water splashed on the plates, but his mind wandered elsewhere. He thought back to his life before this restaurant, how he had had to deal with prejudice since childhood, how he had always felt different. He remembered the times when he had been excluded, bullied, or neglected simply because of the color of his skin. The restaurant became an island for him where he could prove that he was worthy of more, that he was not just the black guy, but a person capable of being the best at what he did. But now this island was crumbling. One night, as he was about to leave, the owner appeared at the kitchen door. His face showed signs of fatigue and internal struggle. He sighed and leaned against the door. "Tough day, huh?" the owner said, trying to sound cheerful, but there was something else in his eyes. The boy nodded, but said nothing. He understood that the owner, like himself, was running out of strength. It seemed as if they were both standing on the edge of an abyss, looking for the slightest support to keep from falling. The owner came closer and sat down at the table, gesturing for her to sit next to him. They sat in silence until the owner finally spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about the restaurant, about what we've been through. I thought that if we stand for truth and justice, everything will work out, but now I'm not sure if we have enough time." He looked at the guy, and his gaze showed not just disappointment, but also some kind of hopelessness that was difficult to hide. Sometimes it seems like the world doesn't want to change, that those who stand in the way always win. The young employee was silent for a long time, but then, collecting his thoughts, he answered, "We are not fighting so that the world will instantly become a better place. We are fighting so that it will change someday. If not for us, then for those who come after." These words echoed in the owner's heart, but he understood that business could not be supported only by ideals. Economic reality dictated its harsh conditions. Despite all efforts, it was increasingly difficult for them to pay rent, salaries, and keep the restaurant afloat. A few weeks later, after much discussion with the team, the owner made a tough decision to close the restaurant. It was a moment that hit everyone. Those who had worked there for many years felt like they were losing more than just their jobs, but something more, a place where they had once believed in the possibility of change. The farewell evening was bittersweet. The guy stood at the counter, looking out at the empty room. This restaurant had been his chance to prove to himself and others that he was worthy of equality and respect, but now it was closing, and with it, a piece of his hopes. But the most painful moment came when he and the owner gathered at the door for the last time. The owner extended his hand and said quietly, "You've given us more than you know. We haven't failed. We've shown that there is another way. Let this be the beginning, not the end." The boy shook his hand, but inside he was gnawing at the sense of loss. He knew that their small victory had proved too fragile when confronted with the cruelty and prejudice of the world outside these walls. The next day, when they closed the restaurant doors for good, the boy stood outside and looked at the sign that was no longer illuminated. He felt empty, but somewhere deep inside, there was a small glimmer of hope. This story wasn't over yet. Perhaps their fight was just one of many on the way to something greater. And though the restaurant was closed, he knew that his voice, his actions, and his resilience would live on with those who worked alongside him. They had witnessed the fight for justice, and the experience had changed each of them. Racism had not been defeated, but its masks had been torn off, and the world could no longer turn a blind eye. The journey was just beginning. Several months had passed since the restaurant closed. The young man still felt the devastation and pain of losing what had become not just a job for him, but a symbol of his fight for justice. Time had not healed the wounds, it had only dulled the pain, but there was a heaviness in his heart. Every day reminded him of how close they had been to real change, and how everything had been destroyed by hatred and prejudice. He took a new job at a small cafe, but it was not the same. All his previous enthusiasm and passion were gone. He performed his duties like a robot, without putting his heart into it. His colleagues were polite but indifferent, and none of them knew his story. It seemed to him that all his experiences, his struggles, had lost their meaning. One evening, after another long shift, the guy was walking home. On the way, he passed a closed restaurant, which was now empty. The windows were boarded up, the sign was darkened, and inside there was a deathly silence. With each step he took past this place, he felt the pain in his chest that seemed to have subsided flare up again. He paused for a moment, looking at the familiar door, and could not believe that this place had once been full of life and hope. And then something unexpected happened. As he turned to walk on, his gaze was drawn to a dark figure standing near the building. The guy froze, peering at the outline of a person who was clearly doing something near the old restaurant. It was none other than the same man, a rich client who had once caused a scandal, demanding his dismissal. The man was taking something out of his pocket. Looking around, the boy hid around the corner and watched as the man approached the back door of the restaurant. His heart began to pound in his chest. What was he doing here? The man didn't look like someone who just happened to wander in. He was clearly looking for something, and his actions were suspicious. Suddenly, the boy saw him start to light a piece of paper on fire and throw it in through the window. The flames immediately engulfed the old wood and the fire began to spread. Shock and fear overwhelmed the young employee. He was so stunned that he couldn't move. It took him a few seconds to realize what was happening. The man was deliberately setting the restaurant on fire. It was revenge. At that moment, everything fell into place. This man could not accept the fact that he had been thrown out of the restaurant, that his hatred and prejudice had been exposed. Hiding in the darkness, the boy pulled out his phone and quickly called the fire department. Reporting the fire, he then rushed towards the man, trying to stop him. "What are you doing?" he screamed, feeling rage and adrenaline rush through him. The man turned and smirked. "This place deserved to burn," he replied with cold confidence, looking at the young man with disdain. "You and your kind will never win. No one will give you a place in this world." The boy felt a long-suppressed rage flare up inside him. He grabbed the man's arm, trying to stop him, but the man pulled away and pushed him. The boy fell to the ground, hitting the wall. Meanwhile, the fire continued to flare up, and the man, realizing that his plan was working, hurried to hide in the darkness. The boy staggered to his feet. Flames had already engulfed the back of the restaurant, spreading through the old building. He wanted to throw himself into the flames to try to put them out, but he knew it was useless. The fire was too strong, and time was working against him. A few minutes later, the firefighters arrived, but it was too late. The building was ablaze, like a monument to everything they had lost. A crowd of people had gathered around, watching the fire. Among them, the guy noticed familiar faces, former colleagues who had also come to see what had happened to their previous place of work. The next day, news of the fire spread throughout the city. It wasn't just a fire, it was the destruction of a place that had become a symbol of the fight against racism and injustice. Many saw it as a blow to hope for a better future. But then came a new twist. The police launched an investigation, and thanks to the boy's testimony and footage from street cameras, they were able to identify the arsonist. The man was arrested, and the case gained major resonance. It turned out that this was not just a random act of revenge. The man was connected to a group that had been campaigning against social change for years, and the arson was part of a larger campaign. The incident sparked a wave of discussion and public outrage. People began to speak out against what had happened and demand justice. Newspapers and television began to talk about how the fight against racism and hatred should not end, that this arson was just a symptom of a deeper problem. For the guy, it was a moment of enlightenment. He realized that his fight was not in vain, that even in the hardest moments it is important not to give up. This fire became a catalyst for something bigger. Local activists and residents united to create a new initiative, not just to restore the restaurant, but to turn it into a center for fighting discrimination and supporting minorities, a place where every person, regardless of race, will feel protected and equal. And although the building was lost, the idea they fought for proved stronger than the fire. Several weeks passed after the arson. Although the restaurant building was completely destroyed, a new force began to rise from the ashes, a movement that united all those who believed in justice. The story of the fire attracted the attention of not only local residents, but also the media, which turned the restaurant into a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice and hatred. People began to support the initiative, directing their resources to the restoration of this place, but now with a different goal, not just to restore the restaurant, but to create a space for dialogue, help and unity. The young man found himself at the center of this new wave. His voice, which had previously been suppressed, was now louder than ever. For the first time, he realized that his past experience was not just a story of injustice, but also a story of resistance. People began to pay attention to his story, and local activists invited him to become one of the organizers of a future project. However, the old enemies were not going to give up so easily. The man responsible for the arson was arrested, but his supporters began spreading hateful messages online, claiming that the whole incident was part of a plot to destroy traditional values. They tried to defame the guy and those who supported him by spreading false rumors and slander. However, the guy was ready for it now. He knew that his fight had reached a new level. One of the most difficult moments was the day of the trial. In the courtroom there were both those who supported him and the new project, and supporters of the arrested man, who tried to present the case as if he was simply a victim of a political campaign. The hatred and racism did not disappear, they just changed masks and methods of attack. When the guy gave his testimony, his throat went dry for a moment, but then he remembered everything he had been through. This restaurant wasn't just a place of work for me, it was a place where I could be myself, where I was judged not by the color of my skin, but by my abilities. I became part of a family that fought for equality, for the rights of all people, and when this man decided to destroy all of that, he showed that he was not ready to accept change. But change will come, whether we like it or not. His words sounded reserved but confident. The judge listened attentively, and the audience in the courtroom froze. At that moment, the guy felt that his voice was finally finding a response. Now he was speaking not only for himself, but for everyone who had encountered bias and injustice. Soon after the trial, journalists and activists from all over the country began to arrive in the city. The story of a young man who not only suffered from racism but also became a symbol of the fight against it inspired many. People organized rallies and actions in support not only of him but also of the ideals he represented. And then something completely unexpected happened. One day, the boy received an invitation to meet a well-known philanthropist, a man whose philanthropic work was aimed at supporting social reform and minority rights. When he entered the man's office, he was greeted by a smiling middle-aged man. He was not a typical businessman. He was interested in ideas, people, not money. "I heard about your story," the philanthropist began. "And I've been looking for a project like yours for a long time. A place that will become a center for all those who need support. For truth, for equality. I want to help you build it." The boy was stunned. He didn't know what to say. This offer wasn't just about help. It was about real change. The destroyed restaurant could now be replaced by something much bigger, a center that could bring the community together and become an example for other cities. The project began to develop rapidly. The patron invested in the purchase of a new building in the central part of the city, twice the size of the old restaurant. Together with a team of activists, they began to transform this space into a multifunctional center where people could meet, study, discuss issues of racism, discrimination, and the fight for equality. Over the next few months, the center became a place for seminars, workshops, and meetings. People of all ages and professions came here to learn how to fight hatred, how to build a society based on justice and mutual respect. The guy who once just wanted to be a good employee was now one of the leaders of the movement. But the twists and turns didn't end there. A year after the center opened, one rainy evening, as the guy was finishing his workday, there was a knock at his office. When he opened the door, his gaze fell on an older man he hadn't seen in years. It was the former owner of the restaurant, the man who had once given him a chance. "I've heard about what you've been doing," the owner said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm proud of you. You've turned our defeat into a victory that exceeded all expectations." The boy, barely holding back tears, hugged him. This moment was not just a meeting of two people, but a symbol of continuity. What was once destroyed was now transformed into something much more important and powerful. The center continued to grow and develop, attracting national attention, and although the road had not been easy, the boy now knew that their fight had not been in vain. They had turned pain and destruction into forces for change that could not be stopped. Everything went on as usual, and the center that once emerged from the ashes of the restaurant became a place of attraction for people striving for change. It attracted the attention of local authorities, activists, and ordinary citizens who wanted to understand and support the fight for equality. But, as often happens when change begins, the old hatreds do not disappear. They just hide under the surface, waiting for the moment to burst out again. One day, as the boy was preparing for an upcoming meeting with a group of local schoolchildren, word came that an anti-racism rally was planned in the city. Initially, the event was supposed to be a symbol of unity, but soon groups emerged that began to stir up the atmosphere with hatred and hostility. One such group announced its intention to hold a counter-rally, claiming that traditional values and local culture were under attack. The boy couldn't ignore it. He knew that if they didn't stand up to hate, the evil would only get stronger. He gathered a team of volunteers to organize his own event that would respond to the calls for hate while demonstrating the power of unity. They decided to hold a day of harmony to which they invited people of all nationalities and cultures. The event became a symbol of unity that could stand up to any manifestation of racism. Tensions grew with each passing day. Local news channels covered the conflict, fueling interest. And then, finally, the day of the rally arrived. In the morning, the center was filled with volunteers who were preparing posters, distributing leaflets, and setting up a stage. The atmosphere was festive, but there was a sense of unease in the air. Shortly before the event began, the boy noticed that counter-rally participants were gathering on the other side of the street. They were dressed in dark clothes, with symbols that made him shudder. His heart beat faster when he saw familiar faces among them, old enemies, those who had once tried to stop him in his dreams. Now they were back, more aggressive and sinister. Despite the dark omens, the boy was not going to back down. He went on stage, aware that these moments would be decisive. Several activists approached him, some of them his friends, ready to support him in difficult times. "This is our chance to show that we are not afraid," he told the crowd. "We must show that our love and unity are stronger than any hatred." Let's prove that every person, no matter the color of their skin, is worthy of respect. When he finished, he was met with loud applause, but as they were preparing to begin the event, shouts and threats came from the counter-rally. These were not just words. The boy felt their hatred seeping into his soul. He knew that the situation could get out of control at any moment. Before the event could begin, a group of protesters crossed the street and began to approach the stage. Their shouts grew louder, and the boy felt his heart pounding with fear and anger. At that moment, as he stood on the stage, pondering what to do next, he saw his former boss among the counter-protesters, the boss who had tried to fire him. Seeing him, the guy remembered all the humiliations he had endured. Many thoughts swirled in his head, and suddenly rage took hold of him. He couldn't believe that this man was trying to undermine his confidence again, but now he had a more important task. "Look at them," he shouted, pointing at the counter-protesters. "These are the ones who can't accept change. These are the ones who are afraid of us and our ideas. Let's not let them overshadow our hope and desire for equality." The crowd began to respond to him, their voices merging into a single chorus of support. But then, as the counter-protesters got closer, they began throwing objects toward the center, trying to disrupt the event. The tension in the air became almost palpable. The boy knew he couldn't let this turn violent. He picked up the microphone and addressed the police who were standing guard. "Please protect us. We are here to talk about love and harmony, not hate. This is our life, and we can't let ourselves be intimidated." The police began to line up between the protesters and counter-protesters, but the conflict continued to escalate. Suddenly, one of the aggressive protesters threw a rock at the guy, and that was the last straw. The protesters from the hate side began to rush at them, and a full-blown brawl broke out. At that moment, the boy felt his heart break. He couldn't let everything they had fought for be lost to violence. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, focusing on his feelings. A new wave of determination flared up inside him. He rushed towards the police to try and stop the clash. "Don't let hate win. We can't be part of this. We have to show them that we are above this," he shouted, trying to convey to everyone the importance of what they were doing. As the conflict continued to escalate, the guy raised his hand at the last moment and said, "We are not enemies. We are people who want justice. Let's talk. Let's not give in to emotions." His words were heard and many began to slow down their actions. Gradually the anger began to subside and several aggressive participants began to stop their actions, realizing that he was telling the truth. The boy felt that the situation was beginning to change. It was the moment when people could realize that hatred only destroys, and that the fight must continue, but with a new approach. The situation began to calm down when activists began to gather together, holding up posters with slogans about peace and love. As if under his influence, the protesters began to unite, and instead of confrontation, an exchange of opinions began. It was a moment of truth, instead of violence. They began to talk. Arguments and hatred began to give way to a desire to understand each other. These were conversations about fears, about what united them, not what divided them. They shared their stories, listened to each other sincerely, and, ultimately, began to find common ground. Although the heat of the conflict had abated, the boy knew it was only the beginning. They were still on the difficult path to acceptance and understanding, and the fight for equality was not over. But he also knew that this day had been a significant turning point. This was more than just a standoff, it was an opportunity for dialogue, an opportunity to show that even in the midst of hatred, a path to understanding could be found. As the sun began to set, casting a golden light across the streets, the boy looked out at the crowd, now standing together, discussing and debating their differences. He felt proud and hopeful. This was a journey they could walk together, and he knew change was possible. This wasn't just his fight, it was the entire community's fight for a future free of hate and prejudice. The day after the tense rally, the boy woke up with the feeling that everything had changed. There was hope in his heart, but also anxiety. The events that happened at the rally made him realize that the fight against racism and hatred requires not only determination, but also constant work. Society, although it had taken a step towards understanding, was still divided. He understood that they still had a lot of work ahead of them, and that this was only the beginning of a new path. Since the Day of Harmony brought people together, Activists began meeting more often. They created a working group, which included both supporters of the center and participants of the counter-rally. The main goal was to establish a dialogue and help people understand each other better. The guy felt inspired when people who were once opponents were now working to get rid of bias. But the discontent and hatred did not seem to disappear. A few weeks after the rally, a group calling itself traditionalists began spreading threats and slander online. They wrote that all activists were enemies of the nation and demanded that the center be closed. These messages led to tension in the city and even physical threats, but the boy knew that they had to remain calm and continue their work. Meanwhile, a patron who supported the project suggested organizing an open forum where both supporters and opponents could come. He believed that open discussion could help eliminate misunderstandings. The guy was for it, although he understood that it could be a risky move. On the day of the forum, the center was filled with people with different views. Some came with hope for change, others with hatred and prejudice. But the moment the guy walked onto the stage, he realized that he had the opportunity to change something important. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice confident even as he trembled inside. "I know we have our differences, and I understand that many of you feel threatened, but let's try to hear each other today." The forum began with open questions, and discussions soon began. People expressed their fears and worries, exposing their biases. Some who had once supported hate began sharing their own stories. For example, one man spoke about growing up in an environment where racism was the norm, but later realizing that these ideas were wrong. Among those present was the chef who had once tried to fire the guy. He stood up and said with obvious difficulty, "I was wrong. I let my hatred and prejudice rule me. It was wrong. I want to right my wrongs." These words, spoken from the heart, lit a spark of hope in the room. People began to applaud, and this became a sign that there was a willingness to change. At that moment, the guy realized that even if not everyone would change, some of them had already begun to rethink their views. However, not everyone reacted positively. At the end of the forum, the leader of the group traditionalists spoke. He was clearly furious and began his speech with threats. "Do you think that you can change our society with your sweet words? It's just blah blah blah. We will not allow you to destroy our culture." At that moment, the boy felt the hatred begin to grow again. He stood up, clenching his fists. "We are not trying to destroy your culture. We are trying to create a society where everyone is respected, regardless of their skin color or background." The debate between the groups continued, and soon the situation became heated. Some participants began to argue, while others made threats. Tensions began to rise again, and when the guy saw several members of the traditionalists starting to approach the stage, he knew he had to act. "Hey, listen, we are here to talk, not to fight. If we want to change anything, we need to find common ground," he shouted, trying to stop the conflict. But the words fell on deaf ears. Suddenly, one of the traditionalists threw a bottle at the activists. This was the start of a scuffle. People began pushing each other, and soon police officers ran onto the stage, trying to break up the fight. The boy was terrified. He didn't want this to end in violence, so he decided to do something he'd never done before. He jumped off the podium and began moving through the crowd, trying to stop the violence. "Stop! This is not why we're here. This will not lead to change," he shouted, moving between the participants in the conflict. He managed to attract attention to himself, and when the crowd saw that he was trying to help, some began to calm down. Soon the police managed to separate the conflicting parties, but the guy knew that this would not end. After this incident, a new movement began in the city, even more active than before. People who witnessed the fight understood that hatred does not solve problems. This served as an impetus for the creation of new initiatives aimed at dialogue and understanding. The guy continued working on projects that would help people see each other as equals. He organized workshops on counteracting bias and seminars dedicated to learning about each other's culture. Society began to change, albeit slowly, but step by step. However, the hatred still remained in the shadows. Some groups continued their attacks online, threatening them. They began spreading false rumors about the center and what was happening there. But the boy knew that they had to stay strong and not give up. Soon he received news that his old chef had been fired because of his behavior. It was an unexpected turn of events, and the boy did not know how to react. On the one hand, he felt happy that justice had been done, but on the other, he knew that this was just one case, and that the fight against racism would not be solved by one firing. With each new day, the guy continued to inspire people around him. He understood that it was necessary not only to fight hatred, but also to educate a new generation so that they could create a world without bias. He began working with local schools, implementing programs to teach youth about equality, tolerance, and mutual understanding. Gradually, a year after he embarked on the path of activism, the boy felt that their efforts began to bear fruit. New faces came to the center, people sought information, were interested in each other's culture, many of them became volunteers, and an atmosphere of unity reigned in the center. But just when he began to feel that their work mattered, an old enemy suddenly appeared, the leader of the traditionalists group. He came to the center with the intention of provoking a new conflict. His words were full of malice and hatred. He began to gather around himself people who were dissatisfied with the state of affairs in society, manipulating their fears. The boy knew he had to act now. "We won't let the hatred come back," he told the crowd. "We will defend our center and everything we've built." The crowd began to support him, and in that moment, the boy saw the importance of not giving up. They were building a support network, and despite the threats, they were willing to stand up for what they believed in. This was more than just fighting hate, it was building a community based on respect and understanding. Gradually, they began to organize meetings with other groups to show that even opponents can find common ground. It was not an easy process, but they realized that only together could they build a society free of hatred. And in this new stage of his life, the boy realized that his fight for equality would not end, and every step was an investment in the future. Although he knew that difficulties and obstacles were still ahead, he felt that they were not alone, and this gave him strength. Each victory, each new understanding was a step towards finally getting rid of the heavy legacy of racism that had plagued their society for many years. A few months after the boy began his activism, life in the center continued to change. New initiatives attracted many people, and the atmosphere in society seemed to become more open and welcoming. But despite the positive changes, old wounds and prejudices still remained, and the boy could not forget them. One day, he received a message from an old friend he hadn't spoken to in years. It was Lena, his first love, who was also raised in an environment where racism was considered normal. He curiously opened her message, inviting him to a meeting to discuss some important things. The guy thought for a long time before agreeing, and finally decided to do so. On the appointed day, he came to the cafe where they had met before. Lena was sitting at the table, her expression serious. "Hello," she said, barely smiling. "Thank you for coming." He noticed that she looked different. There was sadness in her eyes, and he sensed that the conversation would not be easy. "I've heard about what you're doing," she began, "and I'm proud of you, but I didn't just come here for no reason." The boy sat down in his chair, ready to hear what she had to say. "Do you remember how we talked about life and how important it is to be kind to others?" she asked. "I didn't know what that meant until recently. My family, I found out they were involved in hate groups. I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen." He was shocked. It was news that made his heart beat faster. "Lena, why didn't you tell me about this before?" he asked. "I thought you knew how important it was." "I was afraid," she replied, her voice shaking. "Afraid you wouldn't understand and push me away. But I know it's wrong. I don't want to be a part of this. I came to you for help." The boy froze, not knowing what to say. Thoughts began to buzz in his head. "But how can I help?" "You can't change your parents," he said. "I can. I want them to understand that this is wrong," she continued. "I want to organize a meeting to show them that people of different colors can be friends, that it's okay. I need you to come." The boy, hesitating, finally agreed. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he had to try. When the day of the meeting arrived, the boy was full of nervousness. He knew he would be confronted with people who could openly express hatred, and this scared him. However, he knew that this was an important step, and he had to be there for Lena. The meeting took place at her home, and only a few people showed up, her parents and a few friends. The atmosphere was tense, but Lena tried to make conversation. She introduced the guy to her parents, and they looked at him with caution. "This is my friend," she began. "He's an activist and he fights racism. I want you to hear him." The boy felt his heart pounding. "Hello," he said, trying to sound confident. "I'm here to talk about what we can all do to change our society." To his surprise, the conversation began quite peacefully. However, his words were soon met with questions and objections. Lena's parents asked him provocative questions, and he tried to answer them tactfully, showing that hatred and prejudice only lead to destruction. But soon the atmosphere changed dramatically, when the guy started sharing personal stories about how racism had affected his life. One of Lena's friends suddenly stood up and shouted, "You're just trying to make us think we're bad." "We're not." This caused a storm of discontent, and the conversation quickly turned into a debate. Lena's parents began to defend themselves, claiming that they were only defending their values. The guy felt his nerves on edge. He tried to return to a calmer discussion, but soon everything got out of control. And then something unexpected happened. Lena stood up and screamed, "Stop. You don't understand. Have you ever thought about how your words affect others? I'm tired of this. I don't want the hatred to continue." Her words hung in the air. His parents and friends froze, and the boy felt the excitement gradually fade away. A hope ignited inside him that perhaps this would be a turning point. But then her mother, holding back tears, said, "Lena, we just want you to be safe. We don't want anything bad to happen to you." Lena, her voice shaking, replied, "But by not protecting me from the hatred, you're only making it worse. I want you to understand that this is not normal behavior. We all need to change." To her surprise, her father froze and said quietly, "You're right. I never thought about it. I was blind to my own prejudices." His admission exploded the atmosphere. The boy was shocked. At that moment, he saw Lena's parents begin to have tears in their eyes. "We were wrong," the father said, his voice shaking. "We didn't want to see how this affected you." The meeting continued, and although they didn't come to a final agreement, it was the start of something important. Lena and the guy were able to talk about how they could move forward, how they could work together to change the situation. When the boy left Lena's house, he felt that this meeting had changed everything. He and Lena agreed to continue working together, organizing events and discussions to reach people who did not yet understand how hatred was corroding society. However, a few days later he received a strange message from Lena. "I have bad news for you. My parents have been targeted by their old friends. They are being threatened and are afraid for their safety." The message alarmed him. He knew that hatred could lead to violence, and his anxiety grew. They met again, and Lena looked shaken. "They've received threats from old acquaintances," she said, her voice shaking. "Now they're afraid they might be harmed." The boy sighed, realizing that everything they had built was at risk. He felt the need to act, and suggested, "We should tell the police about this. It's the only way to protect your parents." Lena hesitated, but soon agreed. They went to the police station together, where they told him about the situation. The police promised to take action, but the guy understood that real protection would depend on their willingness to confront hatred. Despite the dangers, the boy and Lena continued to work together. They organized a support group for families threatened because of their beliefs and began inviting people to their events to expand their circle of like-minded people. However, their efforts did not go unnoticed. Soon, the boy began receiving threats via social media. Someone even left a message with clear hints of violence. This scared him, but he knew that there was no point in retreating. One day, after one of their meetings, the guy and Lena were walking down the street, discussing how best to respond to the threats. Suddenly, they noticed a group of people standing at the edge of the sidewalk, chanting hateful slogans. The boy felt his heart beat faster. These were the same traditionalists who had threatened them. He clenched his fists, but Lena pulled him along. "Let's go," she whispered. "No," the boy replied, turning to face her. "We can't just run away. We have to show that we're not afraid." Lena looked at him, her eyes full of determination. "Okay, but we have to be careful." They came closer and the boy collected his thoughts when a group of people began to notice them. He raised his hand and shouted, "We are here to show that hate cannot win." The people standing on the street started laughing and shouting back. It was a real confrontation. and the guy felt adrenaline filling his body. He knew it could be dangerous, but he wasn't thinking about the consequences right now. Lena, noticing the tension, shouted, "We don't want to quarrel, we are here to talk and understand each other." And at that moment, something unexpected happened. One of the group members, who had been silent until then, suddenly stepped forward and said, "I'm tired of hatred, I want change, too." This turn of events surprised everyone, including the traditionalists themselves. The other members of the group began to whisper, puzzled. Soon someone in their ranks also raised their voice, "I don't want this either." Gradually, in the heated atmosphere, voices began to emerge that spoke of the need for change. It was an unexpected turn of events, and the boy could not believe his ears. The hatred seemed to subside when a group of traditionalists began to speak out about how they too felt isolated. The guy and Lena continued to discuss what could be done to improve the situation. They tried to establish a dialogue, and soon everyone felt that change was possible. That day, the boy realized that even in the most difficult circumstances, you can find light and hope. With every step they took, they were getting closer to creating a society where hatred would have no place. And though the road to change was long and full of trials, he knew they were not alone. Now their fight was not only for themselves, but for a future in which everyone would be worthy of respect, love, and understanding. With each new day, the guy and Lena continued to build a growing dialogue between different layers of society. Their initiative attracted attention, and they began to receive invitations to various events, from school meetings to city forums. This was incredibly inspiring, but also alarming, as they understood that they would face harsh contradictions. One day, they were invited to a discussion at a local school where students were asked to speak out about racism and bias. The audience was packed with teachers, parents, and even local government officials. The atmosphere was tense. The boy and Lena felt their hearts pounding in unison as they walked onto the stage. Lena began to talk about her feelings, about how difficult it was to grow up in an environment where hatred and prejudice were the norm. She shared her experiences and the realization that true love and understanding can change everything. But as soon as she finished, an older student came up on stage and began to claim that all of this is just made-up problems and blame distribution. The guy couldn't stand by. He stood up and said, "You can't ignore what's going on around you. We live in a society where racism is still present. We have to be willing to discuss it openly, and not hide behind prejudices." The guy's words caused a storm of indignation among some of those present. Some began shouting insults, others supported him. This created real chaos, and Lena felt that the tension in the room had reached a critical point. To calm the situation, she suggested a break. People began to leave, and Lena, shocked by what was happening, looked at the guy. "We have to do something to change this. People need to hear how important it is to talk openly about their feelings." After the break, they held a discussion group where everyone could express their thoughts. The guy and Lena sat together, ready to listen to everyone, even if it meant facing hostility. And as soon as they started, more and more conflicting opinions began to emerge among the audience. Some expressed their fears that their habits and beliefs would be challenged. Others, on the contrary, shared their stories of how racism had touched their lives. Each new voice added depth to the discussion. Gradually, as the discussion unfolded, it became apparent that many were unaware of how their words and actions affected others. One parent, a middle-aged man, said, "I never thought about how my jokes about others could hurt. I thought they were just jokes." This was a turning point for many. Lena and the guy were able to point out how easily misunderstandings and hatred can grow from seemingly innocuous comments. The conversation deepened and many began to openly share their thoughts on racism, bias, and fears they carried within themselves. However, there were also those in the audience who rejected the ideas of the boy and Lena. One of them, a lone voice, said, "I don't believe that racism still exists in our society. It's all made up to get attention." The boy was prepared for this. "Racism comes in many forms," he said. "It's not always physical violence. It can also be bias that shows in our words and actions. We have to work together to change that." After that, a lot of people started asking questions, and that was the spark that could ignite the flame of change. They discussed how discrimination can be not only in the form of overt hatred, but also in a system where some groups are given fewer opportunities. A few weeks later, when the boy and Lena's activism had become part of public life, they organized a larger event dedicated to the fight against racism. They were joined by local organizations, celebrities, and public figures. They invited people from all over to share their stories and find ways to unite. On the day of the event, the square was full of people. They were not only discussing problems, but also proposing solutions. The guy felt the energy in the crowd fill him as he spoke on stage, sharing his story and his hope for the future. "We can build a world where love and understanding prevail over hate," he said, his voice loud and confident. Yet all the while, the shadow of hatred haunted them. Some of the older groups that had rejected the idea of change began to act. They committed acts of vandalism, made threats, and even called for violence. One day, the boy and Lena came to the park where one of the events was planned and found that all the posters symbolizing their movement had been destroyed. This was a real blow to their morale. Lena cried when she saw all these destroyed hopes. "These are just temporary obstacles," the boy said, trying to calm her down. "We can't give up. We have to keep talking about what's right." They went back to organizing their event, but now they realized that this was not just a fight for change, it was a fight for their safety and the safety of everyone who supported them. Their efforts did not go unnoticed. Over time, they received support from other organizations that were also fighting racism. Together, they created a powerful coalition that began to carry out joint actions, opening the eyes of society to the problems of racism. However, there were still dark clouds on the horizon. As the coalition began to gain popularity, threats began to arrive. One night, the boy received a phone call. On the other side, a menacing voice said, "You will not stop until it is too late." This threat led them to discuss safety and security. They realized that the movement for change was now attracting the attention of those who did not want change. This realization strengthened their resolve to continue their work. Things moved quickly. They organized a march for diversity and against racism, and soon word got out that their actions were getting media attention. They decided to make them more visible and invited people who had experienced racism themselves to share their stories. There were thousands of people at the march, which took place in the very center of the city. When they took to the streets, the boy and Lena realized that this event was not just a protest. It was an act of love, unity, and a desire for change. However, the boy noticed a familiar face among the crowd. It was the same senior student who had previously stated that all these are made-up problems. At that moment, he saw him standing and looking at the crowd with discontent. As he approached him, the boy felt his heart skip a beat. "You still don't believe it?" he asked. The boy looked him in the eye and said, "I came to understand. I don't want to be in ignorance anymore." These words became a turning point, symbolizing that change is possible even in the most closed minds. They exchanged glances, and the boy felt the darkness begin to dissipate. Eventually, through their efforts and working together, the boy and Lena began to see real change. Their community became more open to discussing racism, and hatred began to be condemned. People began to openly talk about their fears, share stories, and find ways to coexist. It had not been an easy road, and the boy knew there was still much work to be done, but he also realized that even the deepest prejudices could be overcome through dialogue, understanding, and love. And although the shadows of hatred still haunted them, he felt that there was a bright future ahead, where everyone could live in peace and harmony. With each passing day, the efforts of the boy and Lena continued to bear fruit. Their March for Diversity became an annual event, attracting more and more participants. The team they had created began to grow. They were joined by activists, teachers, and even businessmen who understood the importance of their mission. Together, they organized educational programs in schools where they discussed racism, discrimination, and the importance of cultural diversity. At these meetings, students shared their experiences, including many young people who had not previously realized how words and actions could hurt others. At one meeting, a girl, a high school student, told how her best friend stopped talking to her after she used a racist joke in a conversation. "I never thought it would hurt our relationship," she admitted. "Now I realize how easy it is to hurt without even realizing it." These revelations encouraged others to share their stories. and the dialogue became more open and honest. However, not everyone followed suit. Some members of the community remained resistant to change. One evening, when the boy and Lena were preparing for the next event, they received an anonymous message threatening to kill them if they did not stop their actions. Fear was born in the boy's heart. He understood that their movement was starting to cause hatred and rage among those who did not want change. The next day they met with their team members. "We can't let fear stop us," the boy said, his voice shaking with emotion. "If we give in, everything we've fought for will be lost. We must show that hatred has no power over us." Inspired by his determination, Lena added, "We must be prepared for confrontation, but we cannot give up. We need to create a space where everyone can safely share their stories." The gathering sparked a lot of discussion about how they could protect themselves and continue their work. They were joined by a lawyer who offered ideas on how to create a safety net for activists. They agreed to use social media to inform people of the risks they might face and how to seek help. Despite the threats, the boy and Lena held another march. They gathered a huge crowd, many of whom came with posters with slogans against racism and for equality. The atmosphere was filled with support, and when they went on stage, the boy felt an incredible strength coming from the unity of the people around them. However, in the crowd, the boy noticed a group of people standing to the side, arms crossed, looking on with displeasure. These were members of the same traditionalists group that had threatened them earlier. Suddenly, one of them, the one who had always been against them, stepped forward and began shouting insults. The boy felt the adrenaline rising in him, but instead of giving in to his emotions, he gathered his strength and began to speak. "We are here to fight for love and unity. We are all human beings, and each of us has the right to be respected." To his surprise, some of the people began to support him. Even among the traditionalists there were those who began to doubt their beliefs, seeing how many people had gathered here for a common goal. "It's hard to understand when you haven't tried to look at the world from another perspective," the boy continued. "I encourage you, let's talk. We can discuss our differences and try to understand each other." These words caused surprise, and the group of traditionalists stopped, discussing among themselves, and, most surprisingly, one of them, the one who had been silent before, stood up and said, "Maybe you are right. I don't understand what is going on. I always thought that these were just jokes, but maybe I am wrong." The boy, struck by this turn of events, felt that racism could be not only a problem, but also an opportunity for dialogue and change. "Let's talk about it. We can create a society where everyone is heard." With each word, the tension in the crowd gradually subsided. Some of the older members of the group, standing at the edge, began to look at their younger comrades with disapproval, but their words had already had an effect. The boy and Lena continued their conversation, and soon more and more people were watching them. The discussion turned into a dialogue, where participants could share their stories and express their feelings. This was the beginning of something new. Over the following weeks, the communication continued. The guy and Lena organized several meetings with the traditionalists where they had open discussions about racism and bias. In some cases, these were heated debates, but gradually they began to find common ground. With each new step, they noticed how the community became more open. People began to ask questions and discuss topics that had previously seemed taboo. There was no longer room for hidden hatred. Everyone understood that openness and a willingness to engage in dialogue were the keys to change. One day, at a meeting, the guy received a letter from a woman who described how racism had affected her life. "I worked my whole life in a company where I was the only black woman. Every day I faced bias and misunderstanding, but thanks to your work, I realized that I am not alone." These words inspired them to continue, and they began working on creating a new project aimed at supporting people affected by racism. They began collaborating with local organizations to offer psychological help and support to those who had experienced discrimination. However, the more visible they became, the more attention they attracted. One night, as the boy was returning home, he was stopped by a group of people. These were the same people who had threatened him earlier. They surrounded him and began shouting insults. The boy's heart began to beat faster, but he knew he couldn't show fear. "I'm not going to give up," he said, feeling courage rising inside him. "I'm fighting for what I believe in, and I believe in love and unity." These words, strangely enough, had an effect. At some point, one of the group members, the one who had been most violently against it, stopped. He looked at the guy and seemed to realize that hatred would not solve the problems. The boy understood that this was just the beginning of a long journey. He knew that the fight against racism is not just a battle with external enemies, but also work within society to change minds and hearts. A few months after those events, at one of the forums organized by their team, the guy and Lena met with other activists from neighboring cities. Discussing the possibilities of cooperation, they felt how the power of unity was beginning to acquire new dimensions. The meeting became a catalyst for a network movement that began to expand to new cities and regions. People began to share experiences, joining forces to combat racism and bias. The guy and Lena understood that their work was just beginning. They saw how slowly but surely their ideas were taking root in people's minds. Each new step was not just an achievement, but also an opportunity for a new dialogue. One day, in a conversation with Lena, the guy said, "We may never change everyone, but even if we can change at least a few hearts, that will already be a victory." And although there were still long trials and difficulties ahead, he felt that their movement was steadily moving towards a bright future where love and understanding would become the basis of life. After months of active work, their movement became visible at the citywide level, but it was at this moment that an unexpected crisis broke out. One autumn night, when everyone was preparing for another big event, the guy and Lena received an alarming message. Protesters were waiting for them at their next march. The boy felt his heart beat faster when he heard about it. "We can't stop, Lena. We have to show that we're not afraid," he said as they gathered in the office. Lena nodded, although her eyes were worried. "But if they're aggressive, it could be dangerous." They decided to go ahead with their plans, but tightened security, urging their supporters to be careful. On the day of the march, thousands of people gathered in the city to support the ideas of unity and love, but among them was also a small but vocal group of opponents, ready for conflict. The guy and Lena went up on stage to greet the crowd. "Today we are here to show that hate cannot divide us," the guy shouted, and the crowd shouted back. Lena added, "We are all different, but that makes us stronger." But soon, shouts began to emanate from the crowd. Protesters, led by those same traditionalists, began to push their way toward the stage. The guy felt the tension in the air increase. He knew this could end badly. Amid the shouting and cursing, the boy had an idea. "Lena, let's try to do this peacefully," he suggested. "We can invite them over to talk." Lena was surprised, but agreed. They asked the protesters to come forward and discuss their differences. It was risky, but the guy believed that openness could make a difference. The protesters froze, but one of them, the same older student who had sided with them earlier, stepped forward. "I'm ready to talk," he said, and his words became a turning point. Some of the other protesters began to doubt, and the atmosphere began to change. The group began to discuss their fears and misunderstandings. The guy and Lena wasted no time in emphasizing the importance of unity. They talked about how important it is to understand each other and find common interests. A conversation that once seemed impossible became a reality. Despite the tension, gradually several protesters began to agree with their views. It was a step toward understanding, but still not a decisive victory. The boy knew the fight was not over, but now they had a chance to talk. Meanwhile, conversations began in the crowd. People began sharing their experiences, and soon a real discussion began. The cries of hatred began to subside, giving way to dialogue. As the audience began to understand each other during the discussions, an unexpected moment occurred. One of the opponents began to cry and said, "I just didn't want to feel alone. I thought that if I hated, I would become stronger." The boy, seeing his vulnerability, came closer. "We all feel alone sometimes, but hatred only deepens that isolation. Together we can create a world where everyone is heard." Gradually, the meeting turned into an informal discussion where participants could express their feelings without fear of being judged. It was a moment of true unity as people began to laugh and hug, realizing that they all wanted the same thing: love and understanding. When the event was over, the boy and Lena felt that it was not just a success, but a real victory. Their work was not yet over, but now they knew that even in the darkest times, Light can shine through hatred. The next day, they received a flood of messages from people who were moved by what had happened at the march. The protesters themselves had become activists, and new voices had emerged to fight for change. The boy and Lena knew they had a lot of work ahead of them, but they were determined to continue. This story of fighting racism became not only their personal mission, but also the story of the entire community. There were still many challenges ahead, but they knew that together they could overcome any challenge. Each new day brought hope for change, and each step they took brought them closer to the dream of a world where hatred and prejudice would give way to love and understanding. It was when the world began to change that the boy and Lena realized that each of us can become a catalyst for change. In unity they found strength, and in love, hope. Their story continued, and together they walked towards a bright future. Thank you for being with us throughout this story. We would love to hear your opinion on what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your stories and thoughts are very, very important to us. We appreciate each of you and are ready to support each other in any difficulties. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new releases. We wish you a great day filled with love and understanding.